Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. And I suppose maybe this, just to give you, is a sort of old-fashioned lecture, maybe in a way. So we'll see how that takes us. I'd like to begin by thanking the Irish Arts Centre here for inviting me to be part of this incredible gathering. It's been a wonderful couple of days. And it asks us to consider and explore the themes and questions associated with this wonderful exhibition. I have to say, and I actually love the way that it's working in the space, the way that it's presented, reclaiming a space, displaying the work of four artists, four important, I think, impactful artists: Diana Copperwhite, Erin Lawlor, Helen O'Leary, and Dannielle Tegeder. I hope I got that right, Dannielle. All right, so it is. My approach here today is to give some context as to how modern Irish painting has evolved over the last 100 years. And despite the exact time frame that I was given, the challenge being here, when and how does one start exactly? Academics don't like to be hemmed in too much by dates. We like a little bit of wriggle room, so I ask your indulgence a little bit. At over just a century old, in truth, the political entity that is Ireland has not been in existence for very long. What was known as the Irish Free State after the end of the Civil War was established just over 101 years ago this year. In 1937 saw the formation of an Irish constitution, and the Republic of Ireland Act was declared in 1948, ending formally Ireland's administrative relations with Britain. However, we also know that Ireland would maintain strong social, political and cultural links with the United Kingdom, not least in the decades of negotiations relating to both nations' interests and concerns for Northern Ireland ever since. And yet, and here's where I beg your indulgence as I lengthen my timeline a little, actually quite a bit, but we will also know that Irish arts, culture and heritage goes back to ancient times. It goes back millennia. And we have the evidence of the first settlers arriving on the island about 9,000 years ago, with new peoples and cultures arriving at various stages and periods ever since. And I think that's something, if you could come away with today, is just this idea of sometimes in history, you know, islands are presented as little, or countries are presented as these little units. It's not. It was always, always changing. Always made up of new cultures, new peoples, new engagements. So we start with the Neolithic period and the beginnings of the visual art forms that we see, these carvings, these ancient carvings. We go to the Bronze Age, where we have, where Ireland has one of the most incredible collections of gold work in Europe that was there. And you can see the dates from there from about 2400 BCE. Then what we go is move into the so-called Iron Age, which for some historians in the past, it was like Ireland didn't exist before this. This is also known as the Celtic Age, the so-called Celtic tribes, which are even now discussed, was there such a homogenous group? I don't know what that does for us in the Celtic nations in terms of our sports, but that's another story. But what you can see here is, if you're looking, is the different distinct cultural descriptions that you'll see there, particularly the Iron Age with its wonderful curvy linear forms, its rounded forms, and its abstractions. That's the other thing, that you're looking at this ancient language, this ancient abstract language, which we may or may not be able to interpret or understand, but this is our heritage. And then also looking at how these ancient forms, these ancient abstract forms, then formed a new culture that arrived with the arrival of Christianity to the island. And then you can see that being expressed in new ways, sometimes within forms that are Christian, as you can see with the cross form, or also in the case of our illuminated manuscripts, where ancient symbols, triskells that are pre-Christian, all of a sudden a three-pointer takes on a Christian significance with relation to the Trinity. So we see this constant, going back and forth, conversations between past and then present, and everything, and new meanings evolving to support the cultures that are there at that time. And then it gets complicated. Just there's showing you some more details of those ancient details. But then it gets a little bit more complicated, and we question how these histories are told, how they are harnessed by subsequent generations for their own needs politically and culturally. For example, how they were rewritten to consolidate power or challenge existing social and political structures. Earlier nationalistic histories argued that once the invader arrived, and some historians put that down to the Normans arriving in the early 12th century, despite the emergence of some local peculiarities, external influencers would have a negative impact on Irish cultural expression. It had in some way, Irish expression had become diluted with British feudalism, beginning with the Romanesque, the Gothic, and continuing for centuries. But of course, this is a reductive way of thinking. From a British perspective, and let's look at it from that, which was also invaded by the Normans, all of the British Isles, both Ireland and Britain, had a shared history, not a distinct, but a shared history, one that brought together rather than underlying difference. However, with the cultural nationalism of the early 1800s defining and taking ownership of an Irish past, and one of the things as a historian and as a visual culturalist, I want, as I use these words about past, the questions that were asked over the last 100 years or so or more, what I find interesting is I'd like you to think about them and see, are they not just as relevant today? But this idea of taking ownership of an Irish past as a way of distinguishing the Irish from the colonizer emerges. It's a time when efforts are made to identify, record, reinvigorate Irish culture with a particular regard for language and music, and also a time post-Catholic emancipation, because in 1829, the Catholic Church rebuilds itself. Churches are constructed. Ancient Christian sites are revisited. There are public displays of devotion. Now Catholic majority have the freedom to express their religion, which in turn takes on a defiant nationalistic tone, yet another marker of distinction from the British colonizer. Catholic iconographies become familiar, become an embedded visual language, such as the monastic round tower, the high cross, and these will continue right into the 20th century. But the Irish cultural revival was led not by struggling working classes, but by an Anglo-Irish Protestant elite. It is from their perspective that the Irish culture was reimagined and reformed. The leaders of the Irish literary revival translated the stories, forms, and cadences of Gaelic literature and songs into the English language, which now brought a new form of Irish cultural expression to new generations of largely English-speaking Ireland. And this literary content found its way, and impactfully so, to the wider English-speaking world as defined by a British Empire. So this engagement actually is allowing it to expand, to engage beyond borders. As we know, a person's identity is not something that is confined to borders or laws or government decrees. National, or more specifically cultural identity, is a malleable, ever-evolving thing. Today, Ireland is becoming increasingly multicultural, made up of so-called native Irish, the diaspora, and the so-called new Irish. Those that are reversing the trend of generations of Irish immigrants to peoples who are coming from other countries in the hope of making Ireland their home and their place of refuge. And let's not be naive about the challenges in that regard. And as we see, this is not one issue for one country or for one region. And in the case of Irish identities, Ireland was and was not alone when it looked and continued to look to artists and writers to define and project national identity, to questions of that identity. Centres such as the one we occupy today invite those of Irish and non-Irish backgrounds to engage with how the arts and culture has developed and evolved over the decades in Ireland, and asks how or if such cultural expressions are or ever can be a litmus test for an ever-changing political and social changes across the island. In the context of painting, debates as to what even constituted Irish painting came into sharper focus in the early days of the Irish revival. Thomas Davis, the Young Irelander, a political organisation that was looking for independence in Ireland post-famine, called for the school of Irish painting, called for Irish artists to depict Irish subjects, to celebrate heroic scenes from Irish history. A.E., this is George Russell, the poet. As the early 20th century loomed, there was more sustained calls for a school of Irish painting, and argued that to find a native form of expression, an existing practice of Irish artists primarily looking to Britain for training, for inspiration, and for markets had to change. Increasing numbers of Irish artists, like their British and American counterparts, began to engage with European realism as they looked for a modern model. Revivalists such as the writer, as I said, George Russell, known under the pseudonym A.E., called on artists to look to the French schools, like Barbizon, the Impressionists, because they advocated looking at life. working directly from nature. And to do so would see the artist avoid contrivance, and this called on them to abandon the idealizations of academic art associated with British training. And the other person that was very involved in this is Hugh Lane. He was the nephew, actually, of Augusta Gregory. And one of the things that he did was there was the model that they said they needed to bring the art to Dublin. And actually, Dublin is one of the first places on the British Isles to have a exhibition of modern art of French painting. Now, it was opened in 1908. The modern art that they're selecting, as you can see, is of a very particular style. It's not the avant-garde that they brought over, but it was the first of its kind to open in Dublin. Also, the more subjective approach of the school allowed artists to develop their own style, to develop more expressive methods of painting in an effort to capture atmosphere and to evoke an emotional, connective response in the viewer. The simple message to Irish painters was leave your studio. Go into the countryside, paint the people, the landscape as you encountered it, as argued by revivalists. By doing so, by default, it would create an Irish school. What emerged is a group of individual artists that would adapt their approach, would make it Irish, for example, the subject matter, but the shackles of initial academic training would never be abandoned. Others would embrace the opportunity to evolve a more individualistic style, informed by European art movements such as Jack Yeats. More fundamentally, questions as to what Irishness meant remained. For some, Irish metropolitan centres in the early 20th century were no different to any other cities in the British Empire. Dublin, Belfast, Cork, Limerick. Their cities echoed the Georgian squares and streets of English cities, their commercial centres echoing the commercial architecture of the same. To experience authentic Irish culture, it was argued you had to look to the west of Ireland, where the Irish language still survived, where customs and work practices had changed little, and where excesses of modern life, urban centres, industrialisation and commercialisation had not changed the fabric of rural society. Writers, visual artists, linguists, musicians went west of the Shannon to the Atlantic seaboard in search of an authentic Ireland. In this, they were no different to the French artists travelling to Brittany, to the south of France, in search of the other, and American painters such as John Stuart Curry or Grant Wood looking to rural subjects. And in the case of the Irish revivalists, they were in search of the other to find self. The Irish cultural nationalist movement was closely aligned with political nationalism. Declan Kibert has argued the Irish cultural revival and the political coalesced with poets and writers leading and there were writers who led literally the 1916 Easter Rebellion, which began the journey towards the establishment of a 26-county free state and republic. From their earliest form, Irish governments would harness Irish art in constructing an Irish narrative and promoting and sustaining a sense of Irish identity at home and abroad. Positive, sympathetic images of the Irish rural landscape and its people are presented as cultural signifiers, asserting a distinct national identity and a political sovereignty, one underlined their separateness from the former colonizer and showed political support at home. And what I'm showing you here is just very briefly is a image of a very important event which has been dealt with very little in the history, is the World Congress of the Irish Race. Just as the country was entering into civil war, one of the major events the first the independent government did was hold a cultural event in Paris. They felt Paris was the centre of the cultural world, and they wanted to state and claim Ireland's own distinct sovereignty. They held an art exhibition, they had a series of lectures, they had a series of events. They had no money, but they projected that they did. That's what they wanted to do, to show themselves. And they had critics of the day responding to this idea of the art of Ireland. This is what they were saying. And what's interesting, if I go back to this, of course, one of the works that was shown, the typical works of that was Paul Henry, a West of Ireland. That work, very interestingly, became a major political statement because the French government bought it in recognition as a distinctive form of Irish identity at the time. Also, just to say, if you're interested, there's a wonderful exhibition, digital exhibition that was called Seeing Ireland, which actually reconstructed the exhibition that you can see. So you can see the type of artwork that was actually shown at the time. And then also, to show you this type of imagery, I find this a fascinating idea. In 1932, the government published what was called the Irish Free State Handbook. I don't know if somebody asked you guys to sit down today and can you write me a handbook of America today, what would be in it? But that is exactly what they did. But when you opened up the image, what you had straight away was an image of the west of Ireland. Not even that, it's a picture of Donegal, which is even better because Donegal, I wear it home, and that's where I'm from. So it's a fantastic place. And then if you look also at the different posters, again, look at the images that they're projecting of Ireland at that time, which is really interesting. Yet, as history has demonstrated, this vision of Ireland, rural, self-sufficient, happiness with their lot, is a myth. The west of Ireland was an impoverished place. It was decimated by immigration. Irish culture, in particular the Irish language, was dying out. Young people had access to film, to magazines, letters from family members who had left Ireland and spoke of an exciting life of the immigrant, bustling cities, cars, electric lights, speed, opportunity, and also, no small part, a less morally oppressive society where the Catholic Church had less power to interfere in one's life. However, to suggest the life of those that immigrated, and listen again, I'm in that gang here too, those that immigrated were also ones of bright lights and success, of course, is also a myth. We also know immigrants in the past have had their challenges, to say the least. And for some, for the diaspora, it would take generations for inherited cultural mores to dissolve, and one might argue, do they ever? But immigration was endemic in Ireland from post-famine to the later 19th century. 13 people in every 1,000 on average left every year. That's double the European average. And largely a consequence of this, the Irish population fell from 6.5 million to 4.4 million by the first decades of the 20th century. Rural Ireland was depopulated, underdeveloped, and economically deprived. Yet for visual artists, it had become this mythical place, just as idealized as the landscapes painted for 18th century gentry, the centuries before. And we must remember that in the vast majority of cases, artists looking to the western seaboard of Ireland were not from these regions. They were largely middle class, educated professionals, mainly non-Catholic. For locals and more virulent Republicans, they were outsiders looking in. And that is an issue for Irish art. Where do you place those that are creating art? Artists in Ireland never quite fitted in to the new Ireland that was being constructed. And yet it is their artistic constructs that have been propagated, and for some still do, as a metaphorical view of the West. But there are those that would push back. There were those that would question and challenge the concept of essentialism in an Irish school of art. And these are examples of that, looking to the west of Ireland, the life of Ireland. And then there are the new. If we look at select examples of critical writing at the time, dissenting voices can be heard among a new generation of artists, just as the new state was emerging. They suggest that rather than all artists acquiescing to a nascent, essentialized, inward-looking Ireland, a group were once again looking to the continent for inspiration, to engage with the contemporary avant-garde. A small but determined group of artists challenged pervading aesthetics of Irish revivalism, namely images of the west of Ireland, which for them had run its course. Instead, they idealistically advocated for a more cosmopolitan, artistic and pluralist agenda to emerge within the newly independent Irish Free State. And I think for a lot, pre-independence, there was this belief that that might be what Ireland would become. There was a belief that it would be a place for artists, regardless of religion, background, that it was going to be a place that was welcoming and open, and for some, they ended up becoming very disappointed in that. They wished to make art that was more nuanced, a less truncated form of Irish cultural identity, an identity that remained cognizant of and drew from its own cultural heritage, but one firmly placed within wider international modernism. For some artists beginning their career in Ireland as they gained independence, they faced significant challenges coalescing their own artistic impulses with nationalist, political and social agendas of the Irish Free State. Young Dublin artists such as Cecil French-Salkett, Stella Stein, Maine Jellett lived in the city. They travelled abroad. They were outward-looking. Any imposition of a metaphorically nationalised west of Ireland would narrow their search for a subjective, reflective form of artistic expression. A distinctive feature of visual culture in Ireland has been the absence of a singular, identifiable art movement. No self-named or critically identified group sharing a common philosophy or style emerged in the first decades of the 20th century. While a number of art societies and exhibition bodies do materialise, they were broad churches. No particular focused agenda or manifesto driving their activities. Artists had themselves were their own lone voice. Irish artists working in the first decades of the 20th century looked to European modernist movements, primarily trained abroad, worked as individuals, thus it can be argued were viewed as culturally removed from the Irish establishment, many receiving negative criticism in the press and isolation from leading pre-independence art bodies such as the Orthodox Royal Hibernian Academy. They were working within a very limited and conservative art market. Within Irish art, the modern movement is seen to be led by a small number of individuals, as said Jellett, Steen, Swansea, and the older Jack Yates. Each were recognised by being informed to a greater or lesser extent by their knowledge of, experience of modernist movements abroad. For those that did have this relationship with international art movements, it demonstrated a self-confidence, you could argue, a willingness to engage with and contribute to international art discourse and to introduce it to Irish audiences despite, at their best, their lukewarm reception. But it is also important to note, despite challenges to be accepted in Ireland, this new generation of Irish modernist artists and a smaller group of Irish critics, they did not simply accept the dogmas of high European modernism. They were willing to criticise European art movements when compelled to do so, and they rejected any attempts at formally or theoretically categorising contemporary Irish practice. For example, the Klaxon, an Irish international quarterly, this is a rare thing, I'll explain in a second, came into being when a young Dublin writer, A.J. Leventhal, review of James Joyce's Ulysses was rejected by the Dublin magazine, a well-established literary magazine at the time. Its editor, Seamus O'Sullivan, was obliged to reject Leventhal's critique when the publication's printers, it was the printers who refused to handle anything that reinforced Joyce, by this time infamous text. And forgive me, I don't think there's ever an Irish scholar that stands here and doesn't mention Joyce at some time. But what I will say, it's a brief reference, okay? But Leventhal, in setting up the Klaxon, which would include his review of Ulysses, envisaged the publication to be a new, relevant, youthful voice within Irish cultural circles. Among its intentions was to be modern and experimental. In defiance of revivalist agendas, he claimed he was, and this is his quote, "the offspring of gin and vermouth in a local public house. We swore we were the young and we could assert our youth with all its follies. We rallied against the psychopedantic parlours of our elders, their maidenly consorts, hoping the while, with an excess of peekabah and banter, a whiff of Dadaist Europe to kick Ireland into wakefulness." Big claim for a 20-year-old. Also included was Thomas McGreevy, who would become an important voice in Irish art criticism and would become the director of the National Gallery in Dublin. He contributed to the Klaxon, and what he contributed was a review of the work of Minnie Jellett. And you're looking here, Minnie Jellett is recognised as being the first abstract painter in Ireland, something she's recognised as. She was taught by André Lehaut and Albert Glaise in Paris. In an article, McGreevy gives the opportunity to condemn the conservative taste within Ireland and the population's lack of knowledge with regard to modern art, noting that Irish critics are hopelessly at sea in front of her work, and that as their predecessors were about Picasso. McGreevy's comments were in response to the critical commentary of Jellett's work from the previous year. Painting decoration, along with other similar examples, was exhibited by Jellett at the Society of Dublin Painters in 1923. This is the year, by the way, as well, of the end of the Civil War. So it is a very much a time of flux in Ireland. Jellett's painting represents one of the first purely abstract works to be displayed by an Irish artist. And the reviews were quoted by scholars as an example, and have been since quoted by scholars as an example of a lack of willingness, or as McGreevy argues, the inability of Irish audiences to engage with modern art. The Irish Times, under the title Freak Pictures, wrote that Jellett's composition, they are squares, cubes, odd shapes and clashing colours. They may, to the man who understands the most up-to-date modern art, mean something, but to me they're an insoluble puzzle. George Russell, the person who had advocated engaging with France, he described the work as subhuman, artistic malaria. However, in his Claxon criticism, Jellett, McGreevy is not simply acting as an apologist for the artist, which I find interesting. While the progressive attitudes and practices within French modernism were acknowledged by McGreevy, he was not a blind follower. McGreevy asserts and stated that mastery cannot be taught. That's why Miss Jellett does not need to go back to Paris. She too has learned all France can teach her, and her future depends on herself. So far as the aesthetic value of her work is concerned, it is of no consequence whether it's done in Paris, Dublin, or Ballydehob. Now, for those of you that don't know, Ballydehob is a small Cork village with a population today of 300. So, now this stance taken by McGreevy in 24 is indicative of a new confidence among those identified as post-revivalist writers and critics who sought to move on from the past and break from a pervasive nationalist agendas. Francis Stewart claiming that there should be no tradition, national or religious. During his time in Germany, the Dublin painter Cecil Salkeld became a member of the Union of Progressive International Artists in Dusseldorf, and extracts from their founding proclamation are instructive. What it says here, we want a universal and international interest in art. Long, dreary spiritual isolation must end. Art needs the unification of those who create. And again, this is written in 1922. Forgetting questions of nationality without political bias or self-seeking attention. Our slogans must be artists of all nationalities unite. Again, he's 20 when he's saying this, just 21. He is pushing against so many grains at this point in Ireland, but actually to say that again shows his commitment to what he was doing. Following his friend Leventhal's example on his return to Dublin, Salkeld would found and co-edit another modernist journal, Tomorrow, and he published a theoretical text entitled The Principles of Painting. In this, he said, art is in its highest form is nature, that spirit expressing itself in matter. We would define art in our sense of the world as the subconscious wish to symbolize life and the expression of the idea through form. According to Salkeld, for art to be art, it had to reject pure mimesis. Art, by its very nature, should be interpretive, subjective, intuitive, and therefore the decorative in art must be embraced. There's an element of that, but I do think there's an element of as well the figurative, of course, very clearly in his work, which is another sort of counter argument that he made. What he said is that he perceived, was very critical of Cubist and abstract art, claiming it is necessary to refute the arguments of the Cubist school, who've all gone over to absolutism, and who maintain that painting must be the contrast of purely abstract forms. In this commentary, Salkeld was questioning mainly Jellett. He contended that every conception of visual form is based on actual visual form. Form has been divided into colour, realised by line, idea divided into emotion, realised by intellect. In the creation of the art, a binding link must be association. While the agenda of Tomorrow was to engage with the developments of the modern, we see clearly, as also expressed by McGreevy and the Claxon, this does not mean that Irish artists should follow international modern theories slavishly. Salkeld charged his Irish counterparts to confidently interrogate modern artistic language and form and to formulate their own opinions, which according to Salkeld must find its foundation in nature. So what's very interesting is coming out at this time is that I find that there's sort of two arguments going on. They have to fight the home front in terms of the images of the west of Ireland and this essentializing of the Irish image. And then what you find is that he's also taking on what's going on in Europe at that stage. And I think it's, but what then is even more interesting about that is when we look at Irish art historiographies, this story about this small group of young artists was actually sidelined from much of history. And if you look at art history books, their story has not really been told or looked at more closely. And I think it's something that we need to do because again, and then what we also know is both the Claxon only survived one issue, Tomorrow only survived 2 issues because they decided to take on the Catholic bishops, which wasn't a great idea. And they also took on the government. They also dealt with themes of premarital sex, abortion, rape. They were challenging the entire system as they saw it. And then they were condemned as immoral, anti-Catholic and anti-Irish, which was in the Catholic Bulletin, and they were closed down. And then following these events, what you see happening is that the government commits an inquiry into evil literature set up in the 1929 Conservation, the Censorship Act. So what we see again is that those that tried to raise their heads above the parapet, shall we say, came across quite a bit of resistance. So when we look at somebody like Jellett, what's very interesting about Jellett, though, is that, again, the braveness of her, the determination of her, she was bringing a language that she had learned in France, and she was a formal language which she was bringing back to Ireland. And when she showed this, she could not understand how people didn't react to it in a more positive way. She couldn't understand that us looking at it today, maybe we're trained, we would see a Madonna form or religious iconography, because she looked to medieval art. She looked to what she looked for, a spiritualism in art. Selkirk said that abstract art couldn't be spiritual. He's going completely against what Kandinsky is saying, and then also, as we see, what Jellett was saying. She thought that this type of art would respond, that the Irish would respond to it. This is what she had hoped. She also thought that because abstract art was based on decoration, based on pattern, on form, based on intuition, subjectivity, that any audience could look at it. Any audience could respond to it. And her biggest argument was that if Ireland was looking for a new art to go into the 20th century, that this is exactly the type of work that it should be producing. This universality on this work. This is what she would have seen and what she would have argued. Yet, as she moves on, what we will see is that the figurative comes back into Jellett's work. I think also what's very interesting is that what she starts to do is that she takes on some of these Irish sort of forms, and you see Achill, study of Achill horses, island on the west of Ireland, images of religion again, Virgin of Era, which of course maybe, it's an interesting question, is she trying to bring audiences to her by dealing with religious imagery like this and to help them engage and to sort of help them engage with modernist ideas in terms of formalism? I don't know. But what she was doing is that, as I said, trying to argue for the value of what she was doing and still doing it within a national perspective. The other thing I have to make the point, anybody who looks at history at this stage, acknowledge we have to deal with the gender question, and certainly in the context of today, there is no question that those that led the charge, apart from Salkeld, maybe Leventhal, were women in terms of bringing modern art to Ireland. There's the old feminist art history argument to say, well, that was okay for them to do that because they had little to lose. The other thing we have to look at as well is each of these women, the majority of them were had their own income. They were supported in their own lifetime to be able to do what they did. They had the means, they had the opportunity to do it as well. And as I said, you know, that they fought within a system to try and assert themselves as well. What I will say then, just for the last bit, is I suppose to kind of take us up to today. And I think it was kind of important for what I was doing today is just to give us insight into sort of the challenges that art has faced at that time, which I would argue still exist for many of them today. But for the last moments here of the lecture, later on, what happens then after World War II, or just in World War II, there's a number of key events where we start to see Irish artists engaging with more modernist sort of styles, agendas. One of them would be the White Stag group. This was led by Basil Rakowski and Kenneth Hall. They were English artists, they were pacifists. They left England during World War II and came to Ireland, and they brought with them a sort of surreal quality to their work, a psychoanalytical quality to their work, picked up by artists like somebody like Pat Scott, which you can see there. But there is no question that the figurative there's always that figurative element very often in Irish art. And what you see here, this is Nana Reid. Nana Reid is interesting. She's from a Catholic background, actually, middle-class background. But when she starts to respond to the Irish landscape, she goes back to a past. She's actually from near the Boyne Valley, where the where I just showed you the Neolithic structure, which was Newgrange. And she's looking at sort of creating her own subjective response, but her own mythologizing of her own locality. There's a wee cottage up there in the top right-hand side that you can see, but it's hers, it's her own subjective response. And I think the work of Jellett and people before her that gave her the freedom in order to do that. I also want to deal with one other little myth here. There's one idea that the Irish government, all they wanted to do was to promote this idea that Ireland was this west of Ireland, mythical place. Actually, what happened very quickly is that the Irish government, certainly after the 1930s, but in and after World War II, that in order to assert itself on the world stage economically and politically, one of the things that they said was that our art had to reflect that, so that while the exhibitions in Dublin were still quite conservative, one of the things that the government said, there was the Chicago World's Fair exhibition, for example, in 1933, there was a decree from the government saying no Irish cottages. We don't want any pictures of Irish cottages. So when Ireland put on a display there, they sent instead images of building the hydroelectric station on the Shannon. Or when they were holding exhibitions here, this is an example, this is Bord Fáilte, or the Tourism Board in Ireland. When they commissioned a work of art, they got Hilary Heron. Hilary Heron is an abstract sculptress, and I shouldn't say sculptress, should I? Anyway, sculptor, there you go. That's what she says in her paper. Anyway, but what you see here is that her images are based on looking to the past again. But what's her past? It's an ancient past. And this is something we see artists do, that they almost kind of jump past Christianity, which is problematic, and they start looking at Neolithic carvings, looking at Bronze Age carvings, looking at the Celtic forms, as does somebody like a Louis Le Brocq, who still abstracted forms based on these ideas of Celtic heads, ancient sculptures that you see, carvings of heads at that time, and yet at the same, refracting them, blending them down again, so abstracting the abstracted in his sense to sort of find some sense of Celtic spirit. Key event, Rosk 67. This is important because, again, this is a changing attitude when, in 1967, the government sponsored an exhibition to come to Dublin when international work of international artists, and you can see the list of them there, were brought to Dublin for the very first time. What we're seeing is a change. One thing you'll notice about Ireland, by the way, if you look at its history, it's about 20 years behind the curve on most things. But what you will see there is that they brought leading international contemporary artists at the time, very many American that you can see there. But also what was very important about this exhibition, which showed as well in an Irish context, is that they saw that abstraction was not on the fringes, but actually was part of the mainstream at this point. It gained, Rosk had a lot of critics, it's had a lot of support at the time. One of the things that it did do, that some people had an issue with, if you notice it says an international exhibition of modern painting and ancient Celtic art. So what they did is they took artifacts from the National Museum and put them beside it to make this connection between an ancient past and then making the connection with the contemporary as well, to say that there was these tangible links. And also one of the words that was bandied around quite a bit would be the spiritual as well, finding the spiritual in the art. Some were horrified by it. In fact, the archaeologists that were from the National Museum, one of them said, examples of our ancient heritage, the majority of them religious monuments, are being used as a gimmick to support a selection of profane paintings, not one of which is more than 4 years old and none of which has been painted by an Irishman. We take the gendered language, we just have to deal with that. But the point being is that there was actually some pushback on this idea of trying to bring international voices together with supposedly an ancient Irish tradition. There was a push on that. But some of the artists did emerge, and I'll finish just with some images of those. And again, it's very interesting in the context of what you were saying there earlier, is in terms of, again, hard edge abstraction. If you look at the dates here, 1969, that they're sort of coming up at the vanguard towards the end. Yes, there are artists working in installation. There are those working in terms of film and photography and happenings. But in terms of painting, Cecil King is one of the finest, I think, painters that we have of coming out of this stage in terms of the clarity of his vision. The other part is, though, if you look at the titles, he does make Baggot Street, you know, making connections to Ireland, but there's a universal language here that can appeal to anyone. Camille Suter is interesting because she's an English artist that came to Ireland, began with abstracted forms, but then became much more figurative as she moved on. But what I often find, I'd love to think, we need to think a little bit more about the artists who came to Ireland and didn't have the baggage of an Irish tradition. What does that mean? There's a few of them that was the case. Mary Farrell Powers, an incredible artist, again, Irish American. She came to Ireland. Her family was originally here. Her father was Irish. Mother had further back Irish. But she brought, again, what I'm hoping you'll see is that these universal motifs, these non-specific, non-nationalistic motifs, and yet can be linked to ancient art, ancient imagery, and ancient sort of pattern making as well. But she also brought a level of professionalism, is what we see at this time. Some artists will go back to the landscape. You'll see that Mary Simmons Gooding in this case, but again, it's her own interpretive, subjective response to it as well. This sort of naivety of scratching surfaces. She works up her surfaces with plasters sometimes as well, so that it's almost sculptural and painting, and leaving her mark on the surface as well in terms of scale. Tony O'Malley, again, another artist that worked and created these abstract landscape forms that all can be linked. And I suppose I've spoken to artists about this in some ways, which I find very interesting, is that they've spoken about the fact that they say that if you're an Irish painter, and we can talk about this, the landscape is never far from your mind. It's never that you can almost never abandon it, that it's ingrained in you if you have an Irish, the sense of the landscape. That's what you have to think about today. Others would be Cecily Brennan, again, working, and again, a lot of women working in this field in terms of large scale abstract painting. And by the way, these are completely subjective choices. There's other artists I could have chosen, and I am not apologizing for the gender balance in any way, shape or form. But you see here is Gender O'Dowd again, Gwen O'Dowd, again, these wonderful big sweeping forms. You can imagine that that's the west of Ireland with a storm coming in, or it could be any west of any country. You can see that as well. And Anne Madden as well, these large scale decorative works, which she's still doing right up into her 90s, which are very impressive as well, including this is the most recent work that she was doing. So to conclude, in some way, Ireland is no different than in that it has a complex history, that cultural expression has been used to good or ill to define and project an Irish identity. But what has always been of paramount importance is the voice of the artist. In this case, the painter, despite whether the mantle of Irishness is placed, forced, or removed from them, depends on agendas involved. I think what is interesting for me and these issues have been raised astutely and acutely with this particular exhibition. In the 21st century, post-Good Friday Agreement, a secularised Ireland and a globalisation, what does Irish even mean? Narrow definitions are no longer possible, nor would I argue welcome. I know artists working today that do not want to be reduced to titles such as artists. I know many artists work in Ireland don't want to be called Irish. They don't want to be called male. They don't want to be called female. They don't want to be called other. They don't want to be reduced to a painter. Whereas others are willing to be described as such, but importantly, self-definingly so. And as we experience these incredible, powerful works today, we are very fortunate to have the opportunity to discuss this with Diana Copperwhite, Erin Lawlor, Helen O'Leary, and Dannielle Tegeder, what their work means to them and how their place and sense of self, particular to them, informs their practice, and where do they see their place in Irish painting canon if they believe such a thing exists. What never fails to amaze me, even after all these years, I'm not that old, but anyway, is how history and previous experience remains relevant today. It can inform direct questions regarding identity. It can help us define or expand our understanding of spaces as places of making and meaning, and lead us to a more nuanced and knowing redefinition and reclamation of these spaces. Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for introducing me to so many artists new for me.
Oh, good.
But I had a comment about your 1933, the image of the 1933 World's Fair poster.
Yes.
Prior to you describing it as it was positioned on the screen, the building reminded me of those 3 projections of ink pens.
Oh, yes.
And, that writing was such a prominent thing, but to me, done very subtly. I don't know if that's how they considered it, but...
For those of you that would be much better on American history than I am, but I do know, having looked at some of these posters, is that there's different ideas of projection. There's the America of the future, there's the America of sort of industry. This is a sort of futuristic, sort of based on a sort of, idea of a sort of new technical age, I'd say. But I think that that's very interesting that they're still linked to the idea of the handwritten, or, the scribe, of the mark making as well when you're looking at pens. It was interesting because this was specifically said to be a century of progress. It was the idea to sort of, you're looking at a post crash and you're trying to reinvigorate a world economy and to show progression. And then Ireland realised that they had to be part of that. They had to, if they were to survive as well. So in some ways, I'm very aware that that looks slightly incongruous, that sort of detailed etching, large-scale etching actually, which was unusual in Ireland to say the least. But it is an example of this awareness that it wasn't enough to simply just turn up and show scenes of the west of Ireland anymore, and they needed to show something different. Yeah. Okay. No, you're not obliged. you're not obliged. I'm just looking around the room. Everybody's going, what's the question? No, I suppose, yes.
Can you talk a little bit, I still find it just incredible that, it was really women who brought modernism and action into painting in Ireland, and, and I know you touched upon that a little bit, but if you could really talk about that a little bit more, it would be great.
Yeah. I suppose it's this question, those of us that deal with the idea of, a woman's art history. One of the things, I suppose, which I'm finding very interesting is that part of the project that actually Diana had just mentioned at the beginning is I'm involved in this new project which is linked to traditional arts and crafts, but also craft industry, which happened in the 19th century, and then looking at how this is interconnecting with the art market at the time and the art world. And one of the things that you'll discover is that when it came to certain aspects of Irish creative life, say, for example, in arts and crafts or in home craft industries, you know what I mean by that? I mean, women that were working at home making lace or doing embroideries or whatever, and actually doing it for pay. That was the first time that very often they had independent incomes. But one of the things that you find is that there's this incredible force in that, because it was a space that was not occupied by men, and they could define it and they could create their parameters within that. And I think exactly the same thing was happening in relation to artists that were willing to engage with the contemporary. There were some, I said, Salkeld was one example. And unfortunately, as we know as well, history is created by those who write it. And because Salkeld had the wherewithal to create a magazine, that's why I quoted him today as such. Jellett didn't do that. But somebody like Minnie Jellett and her friend Evie Hone, I didn't mention her, didn't show her today. She went on to work, for example, in glass. One of the things that we see is that women are very dynamic in a sense that, and also the women of that time, because they sort of found themselves on the fringes, because there's just actually, after having been an exhibition up in the Royal Hibernian Academy in Dublin, which showed the lack of women in the Royal Academy. That was actually just shown there. So when you're outside, then it's much easier to sort of forge your own furrow. And that certainly was the case of Jellett. So Jellett began her training in Dublin. Then she went to London and she trained under Walter Sickert. But she felt that there was something missing. So what she did instead was went to France, and she went straight to Anderlote and said, I want you to teach me. And herself and Evie Hone was there. And they wanted to engage with these new ideas. The truth is, and we're back again, there's a lot of this, is that they had independent means. They had full support from their families. None of them married. That's another point just to say to you, that they all went on to establish themselves. I think Stelstein did later on, but they all forged their own paths, and just determinedly so. The problem with that, though, is that then that means you're always put as an outlier. Do you know what I mean? And so even when the critical responses are coming in the newspapers and stuff, it's kind of like there's almost a feeling like, well, they're just these women that went off and did something totally different. And of course, they're not really mainstream. They're not very serious as well, in some ways. And yet I'm saying that, and I must say this, Jellett published in newspapers, she was on the radio, she was well known, she was a highly respectable family, highly respectable family in Dublin. But then the question we have to ask ourselves, and I think actually what you were saying earlier, Jason, is who are their audiences? This is something I'm very interested in as well. Who is the people that are sustaining them to do that, And they're getting it from their family, they're getting it from a cultural sort of group as well that's supporting them. Other point I have to say is that what has happened in Ireland was there was a certain amount of fracturing as such. Artists generally came from a bourgeois Protestant background. And what happened after the establishment of the Free State is you start to see again that it almost becomes siloed, that Irish cultural activity becomes siloed. We're told that Ireland was a very conservative place. We're told that it was ruled by the Catholic Church. The truth is there was little heartlands and little sections of Dublin where they sort of lived their own lives. Do you know what I mean? Where people could be openly gay, where you could have radical theatre, where you could have international exhibitions. So what actually happened is that you find these group of people that find a way to work within a system. Every so often they'll raise their voice, but their own community, their own system will sustain them. And I think that's what we're finding here. And it's only then what happens, what becomes very interesting, is that after about 1990, when Irish art historiography has been written, now looking at in terms of Irish art historiography, is what you see is that the contribution that these women make is suddenly reevaluated, right? And it's suddenly valued, and all of a sudden they seem to be very important. And actually what has happened arguably in the last 30 years is that their stories are starting to dominate the narrative, and actually the stories of those that decided to go to the west of Ireland and do paintings there, theirs has been relegated, which I don't think is right either. So you need to sort of find a way to understand what's going on at the time and how they balance. But definitely it's because I think in some ways women always find themselves on their own, then they find a way to sustain themselves and they find a way to build their own art community. Yes?
Were these women doing the body of their work in Ireland then, when they, or did they come back from Paris?
They came back from Paris. Yeah, they did. Well, some of them did the other. Minnie Jellett and her friend Evie Hone came back from Paris. May Guinness was part of the Guinness family, so she was a little bit jet set. So was Mary Swansea, very jet set. But they would come back to Ireland on occasion, and they would exhibit in Ireland. Forgive me. But somebody like Nora McGuinness was based in Dublin. She was, and actually Nora McGuinness is a very interesting character because again, she didn't have the same resources as the others. And she ended up, she worked as the interior decorator and window designer for Brown Thomas on Grafton Street in Switzerland. That's how she actually sustained herself as well. So they all they found a way. But no, Jellett came home, Jellett came back, and more, I didn't mention it, but they also set up the Exhibition of Living Art, which was very important in the 1940s, which was a countering sort of exhibition body to the Royal Hibernian Academy, where people who had been rejected by the Royal Academy could actually show a sort of salon de refusé as such, if you want to put it like that. But then, of course, as in every case in Ireland, one of the first people to exhibit at the Irish Exhibition of Living Art was the president of the Royal Hibernian Academy, because everybody knew everybody and nobody wanted to insult anybody. But it's just, there's that kind of, sorry, that's a bit facetious, but you know what I mean? It's a very, close circle, so they kind of supported themselves as well. But no, Jellett came back, as I said, and that's when you start to see as well working in those Irish themes as well, which are very important to her. Okay.
Also, if anyone's interested in these paintings, the Manny Jellett paintings and Edie Hone are coming to Guggenheim this fall for a show on Orpheism that Tracy Boschkoff curated, of course, to Helma af Klint, hero of the Forgotten Women Artists curator. So a number of Jelletts are coming to in September, so keep your eye out for them. It's a show on Orpheism at the Guggenheim this fall.
It's good.
It'll be really exciting.
it's interesting because Erin, you had mentioned the fact is that you were being taught when you were in France about, you know, there's so few women involved in Cubism, but actually in fact these two Irish women that went and knocked on the door, and they went to Lote and they weren't happy with what he was doing, and they thought, you know, that they needed, then they went to Glaze looking for much more experimental ways as well. So, but again, as I say, as individuals. So it is. All right. Yes.
Hi, I have a question. I went to Dublin a couple of years ago and I saw some paintings by Yeats' father, John Butler Yeats.
Yes.
And what is the importance, you know, the stature of this painter in Irish art?
Oh, I'm a bad person to ask that question.
I believe he's my friend.
No, I don't mean that. I don't mean that.
No,
No.
because I remember there's like a lot of paintings by him, like in the National Gallery.
There's some. Okay, just I suppose there's the other name in the room that has to be said, Joyce and Yeats. There you go. And if we get Beckett in there somewhere, we'll also be doing really well. To be honest, Jack Yeats, very interesting. Okay, so you take the Yeats family. The father is a painter. He decides he's going to be a painter. What's very interesting about the Yeats family is you cannot divorce the personal story from what happens in terms of their cultural expression. There's a recent television program that's going on out in Ireland at the moment where I actually spend some of the program giving out about him. But basically what happened was he decided to become a painter. He had trained as a barrister. He had a wife, he had children, and he devoted himself to becoming a painter. But the problem was, and this sounds, I'm not being dismissive, but he had a problem finishing things, committing to things. He had visions of what he wanted to do. He just didn't seem to be able to do it. But yet we have this little collection of paintings that he did of portraits, including particularly of his family members, that show him. And there are some people that think that he was a wonderful painter, but he's painting in a impressionistic sort of style, working directly. He played around with pre-Raphaelitism as well, a little bit towards the beginning as well. I think the problem with John Yeats is actually defining who and what he was. And I think he had that problem defining who he was himself. When you look at his letter, and then what he did is he came to America, loved America because everybody was very supportive of him, including John Quinn, of course, who was a very important art collector and supporter. And he came here and wanted to be connected, say, with the Ashcan School. He thought what they were doing, working as well, was very interesting. But he never reached his full potential, which is a terrible thing to put on somebody's school report. But he never reached his full potential because I don't think he ever had his vision the way that his sons had their vision, either William and various visions, or the way Jack had various visions, but they were consistent, or his daughters, and everybody forgets the daughters. That's one of the jobs that I'm trying to do at the moment. But also to look at Elizabeth as in terms of printing, and also his other daughter, Susan, in terms of craft. So, but yes, an important figure, an important person as a recorder of what was going on at that time, as a contributor to debates at that time. But as I said, I don't think his impacts were certainly not that of his son, of either son Jack Yeats as a painter, no question about that. And then the question is, and then we're back to the question, what is Irish art? In the case of somebody like Jack Yeats is very important in Irish context. We keep mentioning him. Many of us do Irish art history. We talk about him and his engagement with modernism. And then beyond the island, beyond maybe the Irish American diaspora, who knows but Jack Yeats? Like, you know, what is his contribution? The same we ask, who is Manny Jellett? Like, you know, and then we're dealing with the whole issue of peripheries and what do people do when they're working in peripheries, and then with peripheries within peripheries, and how do we do that? And then that's our job. That's my job to come and try and to put some sort of shape on that, you know. But I'm delighted you got to see them. I presume you're in the Hugh Lane, I presume, was it? Or the National Gallery or the Hugh Lane?
At the National Gallery.
The National Gallery, yeah. So it is.
I have a question. Actually, I went over to Dublin just last month, and I was astonished at the enormous build-out of, I guess, American high-tech headquarters that had gone on across the Grand Canal, and just, you know, Zendesk and Salesforce and Google, and, you know, when this enormous prosperity, it seemed very dominated by, again, this post-Brexit push to put many European headquarters for American Silicon Valley into Ireland
Yes.
as a way of, again, establishing that foothold. There's a lot of talk about the housing crisis that's going on in Dublin.
Yes.
When we speak of, what is Irish art, in the context of the past 8 years, when you see this enormous build-out of Americanism and this enormous pressure on working people to, just even live in the city, has that affected the art there? Has it affected where artists can live? Has it affected
yes.
what art looks like?
Diana's nodding very vigorously there. Absolutely, it absolutely has. I find it interesting, actually, in the context of what you're saying, because if you look at the beginning of the 20th century, the focus was on looking to France, looking to Europe for inspiration. Then post-war, you can see there, one of the criticisms was in the Rosk exhibition, 1967, they were saying the focus was too much on American art or in Europe. And what we're back now is that this whole, once we get into the whole question of globalization and the impact of that on any region, it doesn't matter if it's Dublin or it doesn't matter if it's in India or parts of Africa, wherever it is. I think you're going to see the impact on that. On a pure practical level, yes, is the country certainly, is it being impacted on culturally? I think absolutely. I can see it from my point of view as an educator, because very simply people are having a very difficult time coming to even do research in Dublin because there's nowhere to live. It's prohibitive in terms of expense. Also, when you're talking about artists, absolutely, artists are being squeezed out. Spaces that once were studio spaces, places where you could meet, where you could congregate, are being squeezed out. I would say there's probably the same thing going on in parts of New York, I'm sure. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. So unfortunately, but the issue is then, do we put the nationalistic slant on that? Do we put it on a case of, I do not think there would be an Irish government that would turn around and say, listen, we don't want another high-tech company because we would like to keep a small group of Irish sean-nós singers in the area of the Canal Basin. It's just not going to happen, and we have to kind of deal with that. And yet we also have to say, is that a lot of those companies, no more, to good or ill, are investing in some local communities, are investing in spaces, are sponsoring, say, for example, research projects. They're doing that. There's, it's the white, the culture washing, sport washing, culture washing, and you can have that still. But there is, and then there's people that will push back against that. I think what's going to be interesting, and I don't think we're really there yet. I don't know what you think of this, Diana, but I don't think we're really there yet in our assessment of what has happened to Ireland in the last 20 years. I don't know that we're there yet, and I don't think anybody, it's almost, even after the crash, I thought maybe, 2008, I thought that something would change, but I think we're still kind of going, let's not rock the boat here, let's, keep things tight. And that means when you're thinking like that, it means people have to get back again to these finding spaces. They have to make spaces for themselves, they have to find spaces for themselves, and that's a challenge. That's a real challenge, So it is, but still, I'm going to fly my Irish flag here. Dublin's a great, vibrant place in lots of ways, so I do think that, and we're fortunate. But we do remember, Ireland is 5 million people. It's tiny, it really is. I think we sometimes, we say we punch above our weight, but then, hang on, I forgot. Our diaspora, I forgot about our diaspora. That's pretty big. That's pretty big. So it is.
So I just had a question about some of these artists in particular. I was curious to what degree, I mean, there's obviously, there's influences that,
Yes.
When they're having these relationships to French art, and you can kind of see them, there's analytic cubism, there's some degree of, there's some degree of Orphism, I'm curious if there was ever a manifesto that ever appeared in Ireland, or if there was ever a moniker that ever appeared for some of these artists that kind of grouped them together in some sort of way, or did that just simply happen later as that fair took place?
Yeah, it's part of that discussion is what is Irish art? What is there, and what does that mean? Like what actually did that mean? The truth of the matter is, a very distinctive feature of Irish artists is that they worked on their own. They didn't band together. They didn't come together as a group. Nobody ever. The closest manifesto I had was what I was saying today. That's why I did focus on Salka today, because he was the first person to put it down about what they were about and what they were trying to do. But it was a rallying call that few followed. Do you know what I mean? They didn't. There was never, like, for example, Wyndham Lewis in London. What we do find, for example, is then instead somebody like WB, it's looking to him, looking to them and engaging beyond. But they never did it in Ireland. They never came together in that way. I would argue they still don't do that today. They just don't. You have some community groups, you have some art collectives that work together, but there's no single force that is driving one particular group. There just isn't. And it's something that Irish artists have never done. They've never done. If you look at the series of Irish history, what we do is, and even right up to the contemporary, it's lists of individuals rather than actually seeing them as ever a school of any or a group. You know, the way that you could call somebody a group or a section or related to a region or whatever. No, Irish artists have never done that. I don't know. You're not familiar with anything like that, are you, Diane? Yeah. Yeah. No, please, Erin. Yeah.
What do I do? Press it?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I was just going to say that I thought it was interesting that Jellett and Hone had actually switched from Lot to Albert Glaise, because actually Glaise and Metzinger were the two who had written a manifest themselves called After the Cubism.
Yes, they did.
After Cubism. Après le Cubisme.
Yeah, exactly, which they did in 1913.
Therefore I feel like in some ways the manifesto had already sort of been written, and then Jellett and Hone kind of went back to Ireland sort of almost
but if you look at that, that's what
but it wasn't translated for, I think even now it hasn't. I'm not sure if it's been translated.
No, it wasn't.
I have a French copy, but yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't translated, but it wasn't circulated either. And the other thing we also have to think, and we're just going to finish up on this, is also not to think as well about artist training, because you had very often you had very strong personalities, say for example in the Irish art schools. They were the determiners, they drove what was going on at the time. There's also a narrative finally to say, for example, that artists were working conservatively, they were dealing with the market that they have, which was becoming middle class Catholic, some Protestant as well, and that they wanted art of a certain type. Actually, and I'm going to say something hopefully not controversial, but actually some of the more exciting experimental work that you will see in terms of design and art in Ireland is in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church actually, with Liam McCormick, one of in terms of Weihart, glass work like Evie Hone, or even later on carpet work or any of that, actually the Catholic Church became a space of experimentation in a way that wasn't seen in any other part of the culture. We're very complicated. But that in itself, I think, though, is the strength. I think that's the strength of it. I think there is that strength as well. No, but you'll never find that. Hi, sorry, last question. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I love this talk, and it's a lot of new art to me. Yeah. My husband is an O'Leary, but I'm a Shapiro. Okay. And I see the name Stella Stein, and I'm sniffing out there might be a Dublin Jewish connection to there. Oh, God, and I'm wondering if the people that were Jewish might have been able to work outside of the constraints of the Catholic Church.
Absolutely, but as I say, sometimes they were friends too, just to say that. No, that's a very good point, and I'm glad that you picked out Stella Stein. There was another one, Stella Solomons. And then there was another artist called Harry Karnoff, and Harry Karnoff was a Ukrainian Jewish background. Stella Stein, I think she was Russian Jewish background. And yes, there was a vibrant Jewish community in Dublin. Again, Stella Stein came from a very comfortable background, as did Stella Solomons. And as a result, they could do their own thing. And the other part about it is that, and I think this is an argument I made, like I've made in previous things that I've written, is the fact is that they had an international focus. And I think that allowed, but in one sense that allowed them to get, so Stella Stein, a lot of her work ended up in Britain actually. She ended up working there. Then the issue then is whether you have to assess the impacts here in Ireland, which I don't know. It's hard to gauge them because of the fact that she went away. Actually, Stella Stein, I have to say, the only Irish artist that ever studied at the Bauhaus. She went over there. She went to the Bauhaus, was there for about a year, and then went, no, this isn't for me. But she did go there, which was and she left just as things were changing in Germany at the time, which is very interesting as well. But finally, just an anecdote on Stella Stein, because we like to tell stories, don't we? And of course, it's James Joyce. But she went to Paris. Stella Stein, as a young woman, and she meets. Of course, everybody had to go to James Joyce, and she turns up, and she knew them. The family knew each other from Dublin, and he invited her to do the first illustrations for Anna Pluribella. You know, for his Anna Livia. And she went to him and she said, I've read this, I haven't a clue what it's about. Tell me, what am I going to draw? He says, I haven't a clue either, just go for it. Like, and that's what happened. So, so it's just interesting as well. But the interconnections as well are wonderful. But hopefully that's something we can talk through today, about interconnections as well, and thread through that. Listen, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate that. Thank you.